Good morning. Today is May 4th, the 22nd of Iyar. It is a Tuesday, and we're learning through the entirety of Shas, through the entire Talmud, one line at a time, one page at a time. And now we're studying Maseches Shabbos, chapter 4, Ba'amet Toimnin. We're on the tail end of Mem Ches Amud Beis 48b, and we're going to jump onto 49a with Hashem's help. With Hashem's help today or tomorrow, we'll close the door on the first Mishnah of the fourth chapter. So a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of movement. And so, of course, again, welcome to all of the dear members of our Gemara Chabura, elite Gemara Chabura. We're dedicating our learning today for the Yeshua, for Yosef and Flora. We're thinking of the Neshama of David ben Avram, who is the person that we're currently having the Shiva house. Also Litman. Oh, I should add it to the list. Let's just see if we can find it. Litman Eliezer ben Aryeh, I believe it is. And we're going to daven for the speedy healing of Chaim ben Victoria, David Stana Malka, Esther bas Simcha, Mazel bas Esther, Michal ben Esther, all of those in need of healing, refuas hanefesh or refuas haguf in our Holy Land and across the globe, and in prayerful wishes for good news for all of Klal Yisrael. I think that includes just about all of our hopes and prayers. And now let's share the screen. Yesterday, we began at a unfamiliar. The good news is we don't want to only read familiar things because that would be boring. But yesterday, we covered a new discussion about how connected are connections, or how connected are connected stuff. I don't know if there's a better way to frame it than that. And so we went through a series of different items that have varying degrees of connectivity and varying conceptual long-term connections. And we tried to work through how the eye of halacha, how in the eye of the perspective of halacha, do we consider these items? Do we consider them attached or detached? And broadly speaking, we have covered, or in the middle of the third, we're covering three different types of connections of stuff. The first item that we discussed, and was actually the primary item that triggered our discussion, was garments that are sewn together for the purpose of laundering. In a sense, I would say that those are really conceptually the least attached, in that they're only connected for convenience and for a function of the cleaning. It's a very much a temporary purpose, but they're bound together and you want them together for that moment. That was, I guess, genre A. Genre B, really we can make it into four. But the second item we could talk about is the oven, the stove, with its accessories. And the question is, are those holders considered part of the oven or not? Then we had a whole discussion, different opinions and perspectives, and maybe there's a difference between the biblical perspective and the rabbinic perspective. And then there's a single tool that's comprised of different parts, and it might be collapsible. Like we said, the scissors, they only function as scissors when they're connected, but it's possible that they could be taken apart for storage or whatever. And then you also have a carpenter's plane, which also apparently has a razor that smooths out whatever the carpenter's working on. And at least in the time of the Gemara, it appears that the razor, if you will, the knife, could be detached. And so that is, in a sense, what I would say the third item. I would say there's a subcategory here, or a fourth category, which was the axe, which you grab whatever piece of wood is available and use that temporarily, and then you throw it out. Now, just for the shleimus, for the completion of our discussion, I'm going to share with you another picture provided by our dear Steinsaltz Gemara. So hang on just another second. I'll show you those pictures, and then we can jump into our new topic for study today. There might be a smarter way to do this, but for now this will work. Nope. There we go. All right. What's that?
Question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
You mentioned just in passing scissors. Is the scissors a tool that is that's muktzah on Shabbos?
You're asking a very good question. We
And
typically
there's a reason let me give you the reason for my question, because it's more complicated.
okay.
There's a concept in psychology called functional fixedness. That in other words, the utility of an object, and people's minds can work in a way which is more expansive, and therefore can use that tool in a different way, and that's a higher level. So, for example, if we wanted to puncture, as we spoke yesterday, the tuna can, okay, we could take one part of the scissors, just the tip, and do that. But my question is, if it's muktzah, then we can't do it. But if it's not muktzah and we're not cutting or slicing with it, so that was the basis of my
Doctor, you're introducing a fascinating concept. Again, admittedly, I don't have background in psychology. Can you just, what was that? What is it called again?
Functional fixedness.
Functional fixedness. Is that the ability for a person to see beyond, to look at something and see multiple uses?
Yes, basically, it's the right.
So it's a kind of creativity or cognitive function.
We usually don't think that way. That's the point. In other words, children don't usually get beyond, you teach them a knife is for cutting, okay, not for etc. Yes, you've got it. Yeah.
Very interesting. I think that concept is really strongly reflected in our discussion of muktzah, and I think it's important to bear that in mind. I think we'll be able to bring that back and repeatedly back to the table, which is, again, and we've already discussed this a little bit. You have a tool's primary marketed function,
right,
and then you have a secondary use. And the question here for the laws of muktzah is, how removed is the alternative function from the assumed use of the item? And that would probably have a strong bearing on if it would be a default, not muktzah, or if there would have to be some more active, proactive intent that the keli will be used. So this is a kind of vessel that we might call. So I'm going to recap your question. I'm going to leave it without an answer for now. Your question is, are scissors a keli shemalachto leiser? Is it a tool which its entire function is prohibited on Shabbos, and therefore it would have muktzah unless you could conceive of another use and intend for it to be used so, or not? That's your question. Because of my limit in functional, remind me one more time?
Fixedness.
Because of my limit in function, because of my functional fixedness,
right.
I therefore am not ready to conceive all the uses of a scissors beyond its marketed function for cutting. But ostensibly, not only can you use scissors to cut whatever you're cutting, but you could also open up your bottle of wine, or cut open your barrel, or cut your food. I mean, look, today in where everything is about sales and marketing, in the Jewish world in particular. So you have scissors that are for cutting hair, and you have separate scissors for kids, and you have another pair of scissors for office work, and then you have you have scissors that are good for cutting poultry. So today we're very into probably the functional fixedness, and therefore you have to buy 7 kinds of scissors. Right. The question really is, in the time of the Gemara, how do they handle and perceive that? Let's give me one more second, because I want to look up one.
Now this comes to the old classic muktzah question. You take the hammer, which is muktzah, but if you want to crack nuts, you can use it. So therefore, if you had a purpose for the scissors, a Shabbos-friendly purpose, that would be the same thing, wouldn't it?
Okay, so doctor, afford me an opportunity to actually read an answer for you. I'm sorry, Mark, I didn't hear what you said, and I may have cut you off.
The classic of muktzah, the hammer is muktzah, but if you need to crack nuts, you can use it to crack nuts. So the scissors are muktzah, but you need them to open your tuna can.
Let's see. So we'll get back to it. I just want to read from Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, and I actually have to put out a disclaimer. I think this is an older edition. We should probably buy the show an updated version because I know they keep on amending and adding. But here, in the discussion of muksa, the categories of muksa, and again we've discussed this, but just to rehash it because I think it'll be helpful. Kli shemalachto leisser. I just mentioned it. An item that is used to perform prohibited Shabbos activities. And he gives a few examples. What are his examples of the primary kli shemalachto leisser? Item A, a pen. A pen is used for writing, and writing is prohibited on Shabbos. That we probably could have conceived. But you know what is second instance of a kli shemalachto leisser, a tool that is its function is prohibited? A pair of scissors, because they are used for cutting. But then in the footnote he says, see paragraph 16, which I'll read for you in a moment, which is about kitchen scissors. So you see how much our functional fixedness comes into play in the laws of Shabbos. I think that is a wonderful tool to have in our toolbox. And then he says a note paper or a pot, which is used for cooking. So here, let me just read a little more of his description because it'll help us. An object which is more often than not used for a prohibited activity and only occasionally is used for a permitted activity, we'll treat it as a kli shemalachto leisser. Therefore, that's the law. And then he says an object is not necessarily treated the same way as a kli. A kli, a utensil, has the particular consideration of muksa. Just while we're here already, a kli shemalachto leisser, a prohibited item like a scissors, can be used if you need it for a permitted purpose, or if you need its place. So just like Mark mentioned the hammer, although you can't typically wield the hammer, you may be able to use it if in the permitted function, or if you need a place. But otherwise, because its primary function, its advertised function, us with fixed functional fixedness. So we actually take the average use, the primary use, into consideration for the laws of muksa. And so just to continue, because Mark brought it up, what are examples of a kli shemalachto leisser that has a permitted function that you could use? Example A, a hammer to crack nuts. Example B, you might be able to use a matchstick to pick one's teeth. But you're not allowed to modify on Shabbos, obviously, the item to be functional. And if you have a non-muksa item available, preferably use the non-muksa item. Now, I just want to go to 16.16. Kitchen scissors are regarded in the same way as an ordinary knife, and so kitchen scissors are not kli shemalachto leisser. And so this makes me consider that there may be a certain amount of variability depending on the time, place, and cultural conception of what an item is used. I have a strong feeling in the time of the Gemara and the Mishnah, they would look at you like you're absolutely nuts if you bring a pair of scissors into the kitchen. That's my sense. I may be wrong. And so that's important, or it's worthy to bear in mind as we're going to be discussing scissors here. And why is the kitchen scissors not muksa? Because they're primarily intended for cutting and permitted activities. So now let's just revisit the scissors one more time. In today's world, where there's wonderful Jews producing scissors in China, and the same factory, the same manufacturer is producing scissors being marketed to barbers and scissors being, etc. I think we might have to consider each type of scissors and decide if it's muksa or not. So for example, hair cutting scissors would certainly be muksa. Cutting paper also would be muksa, as would be kids' scissors, because the things that children do in preschool or kindergarten or whatever or beyond are also typically muksa items. But as we mentioned, kitchen scissors, and maybe there are others, I haven't considered all of those ideas. Now, let's just look one more time. This is a sketch of scissors made of component parts from our very favorite Pompeii. And so scissors haven't changed all that much in 2,000 years. If you look, the concept of the space to protect one's finger from the blade or to hold on, and the cross design, it's actually interesting. I'm not sure if people would consider the fact that scissors may have existed so far back. And then here is a carpenter's plane from the Mishnaic period. And you know what? I'm so removed from carpentry, I can't even tell you which direction is the front and the back, although I suppose some of you probably would. Our engineering oriented people will probably have a very easy perspective of how it's used. I imagine this is the front and maybe the blade is attached over here, but I don't know what this.
That's the blade.
Oh, this is the blade?
That's the height, and then you.
Oh, so you measure the smoothness, and then you'll flip it over and use the blade to get your desired.
The blade is in. No, you're not seeing where I'm pointing. The blade, that thing that's sticking up in the back, has the blade, and you can adjust how.
Where you see my cursor?
Yeah, that's that.
That's the blade.
Yeah, that's the back of the blade. The blade.
Oh, you're saying the blade goes in somehow over here?
It goes down, and then when you plane the wood.
And when you plane the wood, and this I guess would be the handle, the razor then smooth. Okay.
That razor lets you adjust the height, how deep you go in, and how deep the cut's going to be.
I got you. Okay, that makes sense. So anyways, this is a Mishnah era.
The other end is the handle to give you a good push.
Now let's just humor me one more moment. Car.
That actually doesn't look that much different.
I was going to say. It really doesn't look different at all. Fascinating. So we have two items that really haven't evolved much since Roman civilization. Here, again, not to
where the wood chips are falling in that.
Hold on. So Mark, so let's look at this. This is the handle, obviously. This is the razor, and that would be probably how you adjust.
No, that's it gives you something to push.
Okay.
And remember, you hold it. So put one hand on.
Right, you need two hands. And so this would move forward. Again, please pardon my ignorance over here. Very interesting. Okay. So it really hasn't changed much. And then again, here it's in action, smoothing down a piece of.
Where the curls of the wood are coming up.
Wow. Okay, there we have it. There we have it. All right, now let's jump back in Targum. Just find a place. We're almost there. Okay, we'll restart over here.
Rabbi,
Rashi. Yes.
does that mean that I could use a screwdriver to puncture a hole into the can also? And a hammer to bang the screwdriver through?
So based on what I read to you from the Shmiras Shabbos Kilchata, if you would have no other option, if you have no knives in your kitchen and the like, well, then maybe you could consider using. However, the odds of that happening are low, unless let's say on a camping trip on Shabbat, and all you have is your pocket knife and you need to open the food. So then maybe you could use it. But otherwise, one should certainly prioritize non-muktzah, totally permissible items. But certainly, good question, good point. All right, we're gonna fast because we already read this yesterday, but Dr. Hammer, you had another comment? You're muted, so we can't hear you. Doctor? Or maybe
Keeps them out of trouble.
Maybe he's talking to someone else. All right, Doctor.
In my family, the last time somebody used a plane was in Mishnaic times.
Yeah. But when it comes to pharmaceutical or medicine production, we're going to turn to you for your insight.
What's interesting is a thing like a Swiss Army knife, which has 87 million purposes.
Right, and how many of them are permissible? Probably zero, right?
You probably could use the knife to
Oh, the
cut an apple.
toothpick. There's a knife, the toothpick. Sorry, some of them have those little toothpick, right?
You can use a knife to cut an apple or something.
You can use a knife, but that knife is not designed for food.
You can use the corkscrew to open a bottle of wine.
We have to ask Dr. Hammer. That would be some kind of schizophrenic term.
What?
With the knife, with all you could do with it.
Do a lot with a knife.
You know, right?
You can do a lot with a hammer also. You'd be surprised.
Listen, in this year we love hammers, so.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Tana Rabbana. A Brisa states as follows: a scissors made of components. the Izmal shel rehitni, and a carpenter's plane, which is also made out of pieces. And Rashi right away says, you know what an Izmal shel rehitni? By the way, anyone recognize the word Izmal? You might see that in the context of a Mohel's tool as well.
Oh.
Right? Izmal shel rehitni. Rashi says plana or plane. So the word plane also apparently didn't originate in English. Maybe it's in Latin or I don't know. But anyways, it's a common word with Old French. And again, Rashi describes how it's used to straighten out wood. Chibur letuma. They are considered attached. So if an impure item is to come in contact with one of the components, the entirety of the tool, both pieces or many pieces, all become impure. The ein chibur lehazah. However, even while they are attached, we do not consider them truly connected for the purpose of purification. And again, as we know, certain ritual purification, particularly tumas mes, in contact with the corpse, in order to become purified, it needs to have the sprinkling of ashes and the purification process. And for that purpose, each item needs to be treated separate. They would both need to come in contact with the haza'ah, sprinkling, in order for it to become pure. Hold on, where's Rashi? All right. The Gemara now asks the question that should be very familiar to us because we asked it just above. Ma nafshach. I don't get it. Whichever way you look at it, we got a problem. If it's truly connected in one item, it should be entirely attached. There should not be an exception for the purpose of purification, where we said that we perceive it as two separate items. But if it's not attached, even while they're attached, conceptually, in the eye of Jewish law, we look at it as two separate components. Even for the purpose of becoming impure, it should be considered detached. And if one component comes in contact with something that causes ritual impurity, the other half should remain ritually pure. Why do we have, and Rebel, you use the word, anyways, it's a very self-contradictory concept. Rava answers an answer that we saw previously for another discussion in the context of the connection of the clothing. We said that biblically it's that for the purpose, it's a rabbinic law that therefore created an anomaly, so we'd be aware that it's a rabbinic law. Dvar Torah, biblically, b'shas malacha chibur, in the moment that you're using the scissors or the plane, chibur, it's considered attached 1,000,000%. Bein latuma, bein lahazah, biblically. While it's being used, if it comes in contact with an impurity, all components are impure. And if you're coming to purify it while you're using the scissors or the carpenter's plane, the sprinkling of the water, the purification hits one part, the whole thing is pure. And when it's not being used, it's sitting on the table or it's sitting in the tool chest. It is entirely two parts. It's detached for the purpose of purification, and it's detached for the purpose of becoming impure. So, this is again a familiar concept, that there is a distinction between how we perceive a tool of components in the moment of function or not. When it's being used, it's considered attached. When it's not being used, their attachment is not interesting for us. We look at it as two separate parts. Because Rabbanan and the rabbis made a gizera. The rabbis created some additional guidelines to protect and ensure that the laws of ritual purity are upheld to the highest degree. So here is what they say. Gazru Rabbanan al tuma sheloi b'shas melacha, mishum tuma shemeshas melacha. For the purpose, they essentially were extra machmir. They were extra strict and said, when these scissors are not being used, and it comes in contact with an impure item, it really biblically does not convey impurity to the part that's attached to. But what happens if not everybody has a chance to study the Gemara, and they're using it, and it comes in contact with an impure item? The user might not realize and consider that the other component is pure and not purify it. And we know the Torah in the time of the rabbis, Judaism, in the temple time, took purity very seriously. And so the Chachamim extended the conceptual ability of this tool to become impure even when it's not being used. There's a lot of words to just say that the Chachamim extended the ability for something to become impure even when it was not in use. Then they made another decree. The al-haza'ah, because the rabbis are so eager, they're so desirous, it's so important that something that is impure achieve purity, they therefore tightened the regulations and said, Hazah shebeshas melacha, even while it's being used, where in the eyes of the Torah law it's entirely attached, the rabbi said, make sure to put the make sure that the sprinkling, the hazah, touches all the components. Mishum hazah shalei b'shas melacha, lest a person come to perceive that even when it's not being used, you don't need to sprinkle everything. So basically, for the purpose of becoming impure, the rabbi said, assume it's impure even when it's not in use. For the purpose of purification, the rabbi said, you have to reach the higher bar, the higher standard of purification, even when biblically it would be acceptable. So they basically took the two extreme laws and they applied it cross scenarios. It's considered attached rabbinically for the purpose of becoming impure, even if biblically it is not considered attached. And it's considered detached even when the Torah would conceive it to be attached, so as to be extra certain that people will always be mindful to purify, and they'll always be mindful to consider impure. And again, this is an extra chumrah, stringency, that the Chazal, the sages of the Mishnah, applied because of how important ritual purity was in that time. In other words, it's always attached to become impure, it's always detached to become impure. And this, my dear friends, concludes our unit in the Gemara, analyzing and discussing different types of combos, connections of tools for the purposes primarily of the laws of purity. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, 3 types of items we're talking about. The garments that were stitched together for the purpose of the function of cleaning them. The tool that is attached for the purpose of, well, because it's made of components, it's a tool made of different parts. And the stove that we discussed, which has different attachments. And again, I think that we can imagine very well, because today, the idea of add-on accessories is something that we can strongly relate to. So if this Gemara was happening today, you would ask, if an impurity touches the automobile, is the radio unit impure in a time where it used to be a separate, right? You know, some cars you can remove it so it's not stolen or whatever. So we'd say, if you touch the car, is the radio impure, or is the cup holder impure, or maybe even the seats, you know, in a car where the seats can click out, is that considered attached or detached? That would have been probably a conversation we'd be having. But in the time of the Gemara, they're talking about an oven, a kira that has components. Let me just give you the fast recap. I'm going to actually use this cheat sheet to make sure we get it right. Pieces, a tool that's made up of components for a singular function, like the scissors, we just reviewed. Biblically, they're only considered attached when they're being used, and they're not considered attached when they're not being used, but the Chazal were strict in both directions, to always consider a tool of components impure and hard to purify, and they detach for the purpose of purification. What about items that are attached, but not because they serve the same function? That would be the instance of our clothing stitched together, or an oven that has the added components. Rabbi Meir says that, again, we read this yesterday, but Rabbi Meir says that they're considered impure only rabbinically, even when they're not being used, when they're not needed. And Rabbi Shimon, remember I mentioned Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he's the one who says they are never considered attached for the purpose of purity. And lastly, we have our axe, which you just take a piece of wood from the ground or from the pile and attach it. It's only considered attached while it's being used. But when it's not being used, it's entirely detached. And in this instance, the Chazal did not even make any gzera, because it is so utterly not considered part of the axe head, because you just throw it back into the pile of wood. That's a recap of yesterday and today's Gemara. Again, a subject that's not entirely familiar to us because of the purity and impurity topic. that concludes this unit in the Gemara. Now we're going to analyze our final line from the first Mishnah of chapter 4, Bameton. Any final comments or questions before we move on?
I was just wondering whether the scissors, when you use them, if they were toivels or not.
That's a very good question, and I suppose who wants to give a proposed answer? You have to.
The ones that you use in the kitchen, of course, should be.
So kitchen scissors should be toiveled,
Right.
and the barber scissors probably don't need to be toiveled.
Right.
Unless you're eating the hair that you're cutting, and then there's bigger. Then you should go see Dr. Hammer.
Right.
Now, the kitchen scissors are only used for cutting raw chicken, then they don't, because if something's only cutting raw food, it doesn't need to be toiveled then.
All right, so we'll need to be ma'ayin in the sugya, but
Don't you use it for cooked chicken? Are you kidding?
let's see. All right.
Have to use for cooked, then of course it has to be.
All right, so it's very interesting. So let's see the next section. In this section, we're going to need a little bit of our chemists, our pharmacists rather, on standby, I think. Bizman shehim lachin. By the way, by tomorrow, we're going to see a very interesting story. Anyways, so stay tuned. Bizman shehim lachin. Remember, we mentioned there's two types of insulation that could be that you might consider using and shouldn't use on Shabbos. There's the types of insulation that always are moisif, hevel. They always create heat in a way that is restricted. That's item A in our Mishnah. But the second type of items are not moisif hevel. They don't contribute heat unless they are moist, unless they are damp. That was the second part of the Mishnah. The word of the Mishnah is bizman shehein lachin. They cannot be used when they are wet or moist. Okay, the Gemara now has an important question. Here is the dilemma, the question that our sages had in the analysis and the interpretation of our Mishnah. Where is this moisture coming from? Is it a built-in moisture, or is it a moisture that if something fell on them? I should point out we've turned to 49a. Okay, in a moment we'll read Rabbi Steinsaltz's comment. Okay. Is this an inner moisture? Is this a dampness that comes from because it never dried up? Let's just go back to the Mishnah for a moment so we can read the list of items. As you may recall, there was grape, byproduct.
Straw, I think.
Straw, crushed.
Rabbi.
Wait, hold on. Let me just read the list and then.
You put dry straw, and then it rains on it.
Hold on. So that's the question of our Gemara. So I just want to see the list, and then we'll to freshen our memory. Straw, grape pulp, the byproduct of wine, creating wine. Our soft material mukhin that we discussed, cotton or wool, soft material, nor grasses. All those items we said if they're moist, it's a problem. If they're dry, it's not. So Reb Beryl, Bernie, our Montreal Talmudic professional. Straw, is it inherently moist or dry?
It's inherently, it depends when. If it's old straw, then it's dry. But I was just thinking, you put it out there, then it rains, and then it becomes moist. So here's my question: when it rains, again, this is just does it becomes damp on the outside, or it reconstitutes some of its freshness that it had when it was? I would ask you the other way to question the condition of the straw after the rain. If that type of straw was before the rain, we would consider it moist or not.
So I think that's the question. What moisture? We're not just asking where did the water come from. We're asking what does moist mean? Does it mean it's damp on the exterior? Does it mean it's still fresh? So that's the Gemara's question, I believe. Lachin machmas atzman, is this a moisture that's built in? It's part of its original consistency. Or is this an external moisture? For example, when a barrel said it rained, or the gardener came by with his, or I don't know, there's a million ways that something might possibly become moist and soaked by an external liquid, not part of its original constitution. All right. Tashema. The Gemara wants to resolve this by bringing a Mishnah, or by analyzing the Mishnah. Loi beteven, you can't use another Mishnah. Where is this Mishnah from? Give me a moment. All right, let's see. I don't know. Loi beteven, v'loi bezagin, v'loi b'moichin, v'loi b'asavim, mizman shein lachin. Elsewhere it says, oh, this is our Mishnah. You can't use grain, you can't use grape byproduct, you can't use the soft material or grass when they're moist. If you'll tell me that the moisture is because it rained or someone poured water on it, Shapir, this would all make a lot of sense. But if there's an internal moisture, built-in moisture, soft material, any material, there's not like a built-in moisture in this material. Anyone disagree with that statement?
Don't most fruits and vegetables, berries and other things have moisture there?
Certainly.
But it's not listed here.
Because not every moist item is a problem. Certain items, when they're moist, the Gemara perceives as the possibility of causing heat. An alternative answer, doctor, is that that these are items that are used for insulation. I don't think people use berries for insulation, so that might be the other answer. I'm not sure which one is.
Okay.
Because it's possible that fermented rotting, when berries start to go, maybe they also create some kind of, I don't know. If I was teaching this in yeshiva, I might have the students do an experiment and try to, take these items and see if it creates any kind of heat. But I'll tell you what, that classroom would be one smelly classroom after a few days. So,
and they'd be selling strawberry insulation on the street at a discount for tourists. Yeah.
They can sell the schach.
Yep. All right, so let's see the Gemara says. If we're talking about some kind of built-in internal moisture, material isn't really moist. Let's read the Rashis and then we'll see the Gemara's answer, which I think we're going to have a lot of commentary. So that's why I want to see the Rashis. If they are moist from an internal moisture that's coming out, that would certainly be a more intense kind of decomposition and fermentation, and it would be a greater, that's Rabbi Steinsaltz's sense, would be a greater degree of heat than mashkin shenaf alei mishiyavshu. Then if it dried out, and then an additional moisture is added. But since when do we find materials being moist? The answer is going to be a little bit interesting, so let's take a look. Mimirta debene atmi. We're talking about that this is a material made of wool plucked from an area of the animal where it perspirates, and therefore the wool was moist. Rashi, mitzemer hanimrat bibein yarchoseh shel behema. It's wool that's shorn from between the legs of an animal, which are known to be full of perspiration, and it was originally moist. It's not really a kind of wool that's typically shorn, nor used typically in the production of wool. And so it sounds to me, if I'm not mistaken, and again, I don't know what muchin is. I'm using the translation of Rabbi Steinsaltz as soft material, but it's possible that it's not necessarily processed and turned into it's not necessarily spun into wool and threaded, but maybe it means like a clump of soft cotton or soft wool. And then we can say, okay, maybe it was shorn, it was used as mochin, and it never really fully dried out. because it's this unprocessed wool. That was my theory, but I'll tell you what, the Mesivta doesn't like what I said. The Mesivta Gemara here says that what we're talking about is that the wool was damp, and it was spun while damp, and it maintained some of that moisture. And even though now it's been produced into a garment, there's still some of that original moisture within the threads of the wool. Is that likely? I don't know. I have a hard time imagining this is a common occurrence, that threads were moist. The only thing that I think we should consider is that thread in 2021 is considerably thinner than what the threads, the yarn might have been back then. So it's possible that we had considerably thicker fibers, or not fibers, but considerably thicker thread or whatever they would make out of the wool. And so maybe some moisture could be contained within the that wool. Okay. You see, I didn't realize that I'd waded into a big machlokes, a big debate between the Rishonim. Apparently, Rab Hai Gaon is quoted as having said, and the Rashba says that our initial understanding based on this answer is that it was unrefined, unprocessed wool. So that was like my original concept. And that is a more plausible scenario where it would have moisture. Once you produce it into garments, it's very unlikely that there'd be any of that original moisture. All right. Anyways, so the Gemara again asks, I know that straw can have moisture, and I know that the grape pulp could have moisture, and I know that grass could have moisture, but since when does the moichin, does the soft material, the stuffing, have moisture? And the Gemara answers, okay, we could conceive of a scenario where it would have moisture. Then the Gemara says, we have a similar conversation in the Brisa of Rav Aisha that says, oh, Dr. Hammer, you see, you were very wise to predict this. He taught that you're allowed to insulate in dry garments and with dried fruits, even though Rabbi Steinsaltz here translates dry produce to be more inclusive. But you cannot use moist garments. Is it plausible that you could find a moist garment? In other words, when we go to the store and buy clothing, if there's any kind of moisture, I think we'd return the item or never purchase it. So is it plausible that a garment could have moisture? The Gemara gives the same answer. Mirta de bene atmi. It's plausible that maybe the yarn, the thread that was being used might have come from a moist and exceedingly source with high perspiration, and maybe there is some of that moisture remaining latent in the garment, and it could come forth, and that is what we are considering. So let me just recap what we just said. The Gemara asked, are we talking about an external or internal moisture? The Gemara originally proposes that it's got to be external, because since when does the soft stuffing kind of stuff have moisture? The Gemara answers maybe it had moisture. And at this point, according to the Rashba and Haigain, as I shared with you, we imagine that we're talking about this unprocessed material, unprocessed fibers. Then the Gemara brings a Braita, which mentions the word moist clothing. And now we're compelled to concede that there could even be this moisture from the garment when it's processed as a garment itself. And that might then retroactively redefine the word moichin to be inclusive of materials that are processed as well. And there's some kind of perhaps distant concept that moisture could remain within the garment. Tosfos understands the Gemara differently than I do. Tosfos understands, period. Whatever I'm going to say now, if you'd like to forget about it, you could ignore the next few words I'm going to say. Tosfos understands the Gemara differently than I just explained. I explained to you that Rabbi Oishia came to add our understanding of the Mishnah, to tell us that maybe moichin could even be processed material. Tosfos understands it differently. Our Mishnah is clearly talking about unprocessed material. Rav Oishia says even a garment hypothetically could be a problem, but Rav Tosfos says this is not in is not in concert with our Mishnah, and thus either our Mishnah doesn't conceive that there could be moisture, or the Mishnah did not prohibit such a type of insulation. But anyways, that is, and this concludes, my dear friends, the very first Mishnah in the fourth chapter of Bameh Tovim. I'm going to ask you a favor to give me 30 seconds, and I'll be right back.
Still warm there, Bernie?
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Nice. Very nice.
Too bad.
It's okay here. It's 60 degrees. It's cool. We have a lot of rain, bits and pieces. But we're a month ahead, Alan, over last year. The lake last year at Victoria Day holiday, around May the 20th, still ice in it. And yesterday up north, there were kids out on canoes.
Really?
Yeah.
But the
I
water
wouldn't
is
want
cold.
to fall in the water, but in the
No.
canoe, I guess you're okay.
Well, eventually the water, the cold from the water goes right through the floorboards of the canoe, and
Okay.
it gets cold. Your feet get very cold.
Only in Montreal could you see them on a lake in a canoe dressed with ski jackets.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Rabbi,
Yes.
so I have a difficulty here understanding this whole situation.
I predicted that we would have difficulty. I relate to that. Go ahead.
People are trying to insulate their food over
Yes.
Shabbos. So they're not going to put straw that's dry, that doesn't do anything, doesn't serve a purpose. So if I'm living
You're
in a
asking about
house,
muktzah or about insulation, just so I understand what the question is.
insulation. So
Okay.
when I'm living in a house and I have a window where water drips, wouldn't I tend to put it there and say it's am I doing something very wrong that I'm going to end up without putting wet stuff? I presume it's better insulation. We're not even going into that whole area.
I thought you were going to say that if this is true, we should start insulating our homes with moist items,
Yeah.
and we'll have a natural heating.
Yeah, but again, we go back to this question of intent, which we had the other day. So would somebody let's say, feel bad? Maybe it's not a transgression, but would he feel bad knowing that he's going to convert something into what's not permitted by some kind of action that he says I didn't do, I didn't precipitate?
So I just want to clarify, when we talk about insulation here, we're not talking about home insulation or building.
No,
insulation.
of course, the pot. Put the
We're talking
pot
about
in a place
insulating.
with
By the way, if someone were to walk in out here, is talking about insulating the pot. But okay, so what's the question? We're discussing now the halachas of what kind of insulation can be used prior to Shabbos, and which insulation cannot be used because
Yeah,
of
so
its.
I'm saying you could take permitted insulation and set it up in such a way that it becomes unpermitted without
Oh,
you
you're
doing it.
saying if you use dry straw, so how does it get moist?
It's in a place in the house that's humid, whatever. I can give
Oh,
you.
you're saying if you're gonna place your cholent into a box full of straw, neck under a leak. See, I don't know enough about the scientific and factual way that this process works. So I don't know if it would have to already be damp for a while. I don't know if the process would have to already begin. I have no idea.
My problem is different. My problem is this question of intent. How do we interpret intent in these kind of situations?
Well, here we're not talking about intent. Here we're talking about what should and should. Here, intent matters less because we're being given a list of items to use and not to use. And so
right.
it doesn't.
So I would like the food to stay warm. I know that I presume that they're right that the wet straw is better than dry straw or the grapes or whatever.
Right.
I put it in such a place that I know that it's going to end up being wet, even though I'm not putting it in a.
So you're saying you put in dry grape pulp and then it got wet, or you let it get wet? I don't know.
Yeah.
I suspect that actually I don't know. I imagine one should be careful, but again, we would have to know a little more about what actually happens and how it happens and when it unfolds. To be on the safe side, just follow the list carefully and don't put it under a leak. Does that make sense?
Unless you say the leak you didn't cause, why shouldn't you?
You know what? I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know.
I never realized, Rabbi, one of the ways that people insulate pots often is to put a towel on top of the pot.
Yes.
And I never questioned whether or not the towel was damp before. Was it, but what this suggests is that it has to be totally dry before you're going to do that.
Possibly. Yeah.
Well, Bernie, what's even more interesting, that towel could become wet from the item you're trying to insulate.
I understand.
I don't believe it's an instantaneous process. So even though I said I don't know because I don't know, but I have a feeling that if a little moisture comes on the towel following insulation, I don't believe that's a problem. We're talking about material that when it sits and then there could be some kind of reaction. But I'm looking now. We went too far. Hold on.
As usual, Rabbi, it's a more interesting question than the insulation. It's a question of something being converted from one category to another, and you knowingly in advance know that this will happen. It's a very serious question.
Obviously, one should not knowingly set up to have a thing that they know is prohibited to be done. That's I think pretty clear, right? I think that's pretty clear. The only thing I don't know is the precise breakdown and the nature of when such a damp item is a problem or not. So it's possible that if you're insulating something for 10 hours and a little water gets in, it's possible that would not create the process that we're discussing. But I think it's pretty clear and certain that one shouldn't intentionally cause that which is prohibited to occur, right? Let's take a look real fast. We have a few minutes left. Let's take a look at the Code of Jewish Law, Shulchan Aruch Siman Reish Nun Zayin, which is the part of the Shulchan Aruch that discusses this halacha. Eloheim Dvarim Hamoisifim Hevel. Actually, let's open it up so that we can open. Here. This is the Reish Nun Zayin. You just bounce this down. Reish Nun Vav, Reish Nun Zayin. Okay. Ein time in b'Shabbos afilu b'davar she'eino moisef hevel. On Shabbos, hatmana cannot happen. Even in the daytime, there are restricted hatmana. Im hitmin b'davar hamoisef hevel. If one did hatmana with an item that generates additional heat, hatavshil asur. This food cannot be consumed. By the way, a question to be considered, although not this moment, is why our Mishnah starts with a list before even properly informing us that there are. It doesn't say the laws of what happens if you use prohibited items. It first starts with what you can and cannot use. We're talking obviously about an item that needs to still be heated up or cooked. If it never gained additional heat, then it might be permissible even if you insulate it in an illegal or inappropriate way. Others say that if it was done unintentionally before Shabbos, not like Reb Beryl saying that you set it up so that moisture would fall, but it truly unintentionally, there are those who permit it, and there are others that would only restrict it at night, but the next day might be permissible. Okay, that was just the intro. These are the items that are known to generate additional heat. Look carefully because we're going to see a number of the items of our Gemara applied in halacha. The waste, the byproduct of olives and sesame seeds. Remember, that was the first discussion in the Gemara. Is that olive byproduct of sesame or both? Vizevel and manure, umelach and salt, seed, lime, vichol and sand, bein lechem, bein yeveshim, bein lachem, bein yeveshim, whether they're dry or moist. Exactly what our Mishnah says. Teven, v'zagim, umulchim, v'asavim. The four items listed in our Mishnah. Bisman sheshloshton lachem. When they are moist, then they are a problem. But otherwise, they are okay. The following never add additional moisture. Ksus, Perais, clothing. I don't know if a towel would be included in the ksus, but likely it would be. Uperais and Dr. Hammer's fruits. The kanfe yoina we're going to see in the next Mishnah, but it means literally a bird's wings, or how do you call it? Feathers, or other kinds of feathers. And again, this is going to be in the next Mishnah, so I really want to just to show you this part. So the Shulchan Aruch doesn't go into specifics of the nature of moisture. The Be'er Heitiv, one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, says, halachically, he paskins that likely it would not matter if the moisture was internal or external. But many others say, it would have to be an internal moisture. So Rebero, now we have an answer for you. Based on most poskim, based on the inference of, or actually it's not an inference in the Gemara. In the Gemara, it seems a little bit vague. If the moisture has to be internal, then you'd be allowed to set up your pot under a leak, because we don't consider that leak as actually going to generate heat. So again, based on the majority of the poskim quoted here in the Be'er Heitiv, that would not be a problem.
Guys who are going to use manure for insulating, I lost them somewhere along the way there.
I was going to say, if you invite me to your Kiddush club and your cholent is sitting in manure, I'm not coming in. From the Mishnah Brura, Kine Hamagan Avram Pasuk Kedas Rambam Nisrili B'chol Gav Yasu. Okay, so some more details. The Magen Avram, the Rambam seem to say that regardless of how the moisture comes, it's a problem. The Bach writes that the Tur and others also are machmir, because they hold like the Rambam. However, many other Rishonim don't agree, and therefore there are many more contemporary poskim who allow if the moisture is external. The Nir Ali says the Mishnah Brura, says the Chafetz Chaim, the Tam HaTur who, after the Gemara Dilam Nistapik was there, although our Gemara leaves with a question mark if the moisture is internal or external. Kivan de Yerushalmi Perek V'Matomim Shitale Bazel Isser, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, clearly considers the moisture prohibited regardless of its source. So, although we read for you the Be'er Heitiv, who says that there are many who are inclined to be lenient, what's clear here is that the Mishnah Brura says to be machmir. So Rebero, if you follow the Mishnah Brura, we're back to not placing your cholent in an insulated box under the leak. Now, one last thing before we go, because we have 1 minute left. I want to see if the Baal HaTanya takes a stance in this regards. I don't know if we'll manage to pull it up fast enough, but let's see. Reish Nun Zayin, laws of Hatmana. Then he says, hold on. He says, here are the items that are Moisef Hevel. Blah, blah, blah. And then he says, Afilu heimlachim achmas mayim soininim shenofla alehem. The Baal HaTanya, who by the way preceded the Mishnah Brura by 100+ years, paskins as well to be more machmir. So Rebero, the Baal HaTanya, the Mishnah Brura, your Hasidic friends and your Litvish friends all would agree that you should not let your insulation become moist by external moisture. And so that would be pretty, in my sense, pretty conclusive. So the Psak Halacha L'maisa seems to be to restrict the moisture, whether it's external or internal. My dear friends, let's just give a very, very fast recap. Today's Gemara, we went through we finished up the discussion of the 3 items, or the various types of connections of kalim for the purpose of causing them to be impure, and we came up with a construct or a concept that sometimes the Chachamim would be machmir two directional, to consider it attached to achieve impurity and to be detached for the purpose of allowing it to become pure. Our last discussion was to understand if the moisture had to be internal or it could even come from an external source. We tried a careful reading of the items in the Mishnah. We didn't initially perceive that the moichin, this fluffy, soft stuffing, could be wet, moist from an internal cause, but ultimately we concluded that maybe it was shorn from a place of high perspiration on the animal, and maybe it retained some of that moisture. And then we brought from Rabbi Yoshi about moist garments that maybe could even contain the moisture from the time that it was shorn. Long story short, the Gemara ends off with a question mark. Our survey of the halacha, the code of Jewish law doesn't specify, but in the discussion, the Ber Heitev quotes that many achronim are matir, permit, or only consider the moisture if it is internal. However, we read both the Mishnah Brura and the Baal Tanya are machmir, and therefore, whether your cotton or wool, fluffy material is damp from the day it was created, or it's an external moisture from water poured on it, we should not use it for insulation based on that. My dear friends, I want to wish you a wonderful day. Thank you for joining this elite Gemara Chabura, learning our way through the entire Talmud. I hope you'll join us tomorrow, same time, same link, Be'ezrat Hashem. We're going to end this class in just a moment, and I'd like to invite everyone to please rejoin to study today's Chumash with Rabbi Shalom.
On the wool, there's the lanolin on the wool is actually what on the sheep. It's actually in today's Halacha Yomi from the OU. It talks about whether the question of whether lanolin would be actually kosher coming from off the animal, but this would make the wool. But they actually mentioned the Hatmana issue actually.
Oh, okay. See.
Oh, look at that right there. They're right where we are.
Very interesting. Shkoyach.
Shkoyach, thank you.
Have a wonderful day. Zayge bench.
Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.